The Galactic Council was filled with representatives from every corner of the universe. The Chlorith, a powerful alien race, ruled over many planets and had dominated the Council for centuries. They were known for their superior technology, fierce military, and their belief that no other species could challenge them. The Council's meetings were always grand, full of speeches about power and progress. But today, the meeting was different. A human soldier was about to arrive. Lieutenant Jack Carter stood at the edge of the gathering, outside the Grand Council Hall, waiting to enter. Earth had been invited to send a representative, and the task had fallen to him. He wasn't a diplomat, a scientist, or an ambassador. He was just a soldier. And in the eyes of the galactic leaders, that made him an odd choice. The doors to the hall opened, and Jack stepped inside. As he entered, the representatives from the other species glanced at him with a mix of curiosity and amusement. The Chloroth, seated at the front, exchanged smirks. They had seen many diplomats before, but never someone like this. Jack was wearing a simple military uniform, and his eyes were calm, though there was a quiet determination in them. The Chloroth leader, a tall figure named Zorith, stood up. His golden eyes scanned Jack from head to toe with a mocking expression. "I hope you're not here to offer us some outdated weaponry," he said, his voice echoing in the grand hall.
Da-da-da!
The room erupted in laughter. The other council members snickered. As well, Jack didn't flinch. He kept his face neutral, though he could feel the weight of their laughter pressing down on him. He had been too many battlefields, but this was a different kind of fight. Fight for respect. But he wasn't about to give them the satisfaction of reacting. Zoroff's laughter died down, and he waved his hand dismissively. "Humans, we've heard much about your kind, but let's see if you have anything worth saying." He sat back, down, his golden eyes never leaving Jack's face. The council room was filled with alien species of all shapes and sizes. Some were tall and spindly, others short and covered in scales. All of them watched Jack closely, sizing him up. Most were thinking the same thing. What could a human possibly bring to the table? Jack had heard this kind of thing before. Had grown up in a world where humans were often seen as weak and insignificant by other species. But he knew better. Humanity might not have the advanced technology of the Chloroth or the brutal power of the Zinther. But humans had something else. Something that couldn't be measured in weapons or ships. Humans had the ability to adapt, to think on their feet, and to rise to challenges that seemed impossible. Still, he remained silent. This wasn't the time to speak yet. The session began with one representative after another giving speeches about their species' strengths and progress. The Chloroth spoke proudly of their military conquests. The Zinther, a race of brutal warriors, boasted about their victories in battle. The Ilvarians, a peaceful species, spoke about the importance of diplomacy. And then it was Jack's turn. He stepped forward, his boots echoing on the stone floor. The council members stared at him, waiting for him to speak. The Chloroth leader raised an eyebrow, clearly expecting a speech full of pleasantries. Instead, Jack simply stood there for a moment, taking in the room. Then he spoke. "I'm not here to tell you about how strong we are, or how much power we have," he said. His voice was calm, yet steady. "I'm here to tell you that we fight for what matters, for our homes, and our families, and when the time comes, we don't back down." With silence in the room. The Chloroth seemed confused. This wasn't the speech they had expected. There were no promises of alliances or trade agreements, no threats of war or conquest. Jack wasn't here to boast. He wasn't here to make friends. He was here to show them that humanity had something no one else could take away, a will to fight for what was right. Zorith leaned forward, his expression still one of disbelief. "Is that all? A speech about honor?" he asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Jack didn't respond to the question. He just stood there, unshaken by the Chloroth leader's words. His calm demeanor only made the Chloroth more uneasy. They were used to beings who relied on power and force. Humans, in their eyes, were nothing but a curious species that would never be able to stand up to the real powers of the galaxy. The council meeting continued, but Jack's presence hung in the air like an unspoken challenge. The Chloroth and everyone else in the room were starting to realize something. This human wasn't like the others. He wasn't afraid. More importantly, he wasn't going anywhere. The mockery had just begun, but Jack knew the truth. No one could predict how things would unfold, and soon they would all see that underestimating a human soldier could prove to be their biggest mistake. The council room was buzzing with activity as the meeting continued.
Jack stood near the back
of the hall, his hands behind his back, his eyes scanning the faces of the different species. The Chlorith had returned to their usual air of superiority, laughing and making jokes. The Zinther were flexing their muscles, showing off their battle scars as if they were the most important beings in the room. Jack didn't care. His mind wasn't on the distractions. He was here for one reason, to prove that humanity had more to offer than anyone realized. He had been watching the council's behavior closely, and it didn't take long to realize that their unity was only an illusion. Beneath their fancy speeches and smiles, the council members were divided. The Chlorith, the Zinther, the Elvarians, they all had their own agendas, and none of them truly trusted the others. The Chlorith were the biggest threat, of course. They were proud of their military might and their long history of conquest. They thought that they were untouchable. Jack had heard their leader Zorith boast about their unchallenged power, but Jack knew the truth. Power alone didn't win wars. Strategy and resolve did. As the session wore on, Jack's thoughts drifted back to Earth. It had been years since he left his home planet, but he remembered the battles, the lessons, and the struggles. Humans were a young species compared to the others in the galaxy, but what they lacked in age, they made up for with heart and adaptability. No matter how many times they were knocked down, they always found a way to get back up. The Chlorith didn't understand that. It had never faced an enemy like humanity, an enemy that didn't give up, no matter the odds. And Jack was ready to show them exactly what that meant. At the next break, representatives scattered to their individual clusters, speaking with their colleagues and making deals. Jack didn't follow them. He stayed where he was, observing the room, looking for the cracks. He knew the Chlorith would try to dismiss him again, but that wasn't what bothered him. What bothered him was their blind belief that they were invincible. Jack had faced far worse odds in his career. He had fought battles where the enemy outnumbered him 10-1, where the technology was outdated and the weapons were crude. And yet humanity had always found a way to survive. It was their nature. And if the galaxy underestimated that, they would learn a painful lesson. A few hours passed and the council reconvened. Jack was called upon again to speak. This time, there was no laughter, no mockery. The room was quieter, the air heavier. Jack could feel the eyes of every representative on him as he made his way to the center of the hall. The Chlorith sat in their seats, but there was something different about them. They weren't laughing anymore, were watching, waiting to see what he would do next. Jack took a deep breath and began speaking. We've heard from the Chlorith, Zinther, the Elvarians, and the rest of you about your victories, your conquests, and your peace treaties, he said, his voice steady and clear. But what we haven't heard is how you've come together to face the real threats that lie beyond your borders. The room fell silent. Jack could feel the weight of their gaze, and for the first time the Chlorith leader Zorith was not smiling, he was listening. You see, you all believe that your power will protect you from the unknown. But power alone is not enough. It's your ability to adapt, to change, to evolve that will decide who survives the next conflict. And right now, none of you are prepared for what's coming. Jack's words were simple, but they had an impact. The council members exchanged nervous glances. The Chlorith leader's golden eyes narrowed, but he didn't speak. Instead, he motioned for Jack to continue. Humanity has been through countless wars, countless battles, and countless struggles. We've had to fight not just for survival, but for our way of life. And every time we've found a way to win, we've adapted to challenges. We've turned our weaknesses into strengths, and that's something none of you can claim. Jack paused, letting his words sink in. You might think we're just soldiers. You might think we're just a small, primitive species. But what you don't understand is that when the time comes, humans will fight for each other, and that's why we will never back down. The silence in the room was deafening. For the first time since Jack had entered the council chamber, There was no laughter, no sneers, just silence. The representatives were all thinking the same thing. Had the human soldier just revealed something none of them had considered? The Chlorith leader stood up slowly, his eyes locked on Jack's. "You speak of unity?" he said, his voice low and challenging. "But you are still just a human. What could you possibly know about the strength of unity?" Jack looked up at him, not intimidated in the slightest. "Know enough," he replied calmly. "You'll find that we're stronger than you think." With that, he turned and walked back to his place, leaving the room in stunned silence. The Chlorith leader remained standing, but his usual confidence was gone. Jack knew this was only the beginning. The Chlorith might not understand humanity yet, but they would soon. And by the time they did, it would be too late. The atmosphere in the council room had changed since Jack's last speech. No longer were the representatives from different species laughing or mocking him. There was a quiet tension in the air, and Jack could feel it. The Chlorith, once so sure of their dominance, now seemed uncertain. The other species, who had once ignored humanity, were starting to look at Jack differently. They had begun to realize that he wasn't like the others. He wasn't just a soldier. He was someone who understood the greater threat in the galaxy, and that made him dangerous. The council meeting continued, but the mood was different now. Jack was no longer just an afterthought. He was the center of attention. The Chlorith, though still unwilling to admit it, were beginning to see him as a threat. Not because of his size, not because of his technology, but because of his mind. He wasn't just reacting to the situation. He was thinking ahead, planning for the future. As the meeting wore on, the conversation turned to a new matter. The Rethnox, a feared race of warriors who had long been lost to history, had resurfaced. They had begun attacking neutral planets in the outer reaches of the galaxy, leaving nothing but destruction in their wake. The Chlorith were confident that their military might would crush the Rethnox without issue. But Jack's mind was already racing. He had studied the Rethnox, their tactics and their ways. The Chlorith might have the numbers and the technology, but Jack knew that the Rethnox were different. They weren't like the Zinthar or any other race the Chlorith had faced. The Rethnox didn't fight for glory or power. They fought for survival, and that made them dangerous. "We cannot underestimate them," Jack said, his voice cutting through the growing chatter in the room. "The Rethnox are not like other species. Their strength lies in their ruthlessness, their willingness to sacrifice everything. If you think you can defeat them with sheer power, you will lose." The room fell silent as everyone turned to look at him. The Chlorith were no longer laughing. Zorth, the Chlorith leader, scowled but didn't speak. Instead, he motioned for one of his officers to step forward. "We have already sent our fleet to the Outer Rim to deal with the Rethnox," the officer said, his tone confident. "They will be crushed within weeks." Jack shook his head. "It's not enough. The Rethnox aren't like your usual enemies. They don't fight fair. They'll use the terrain to their advantage. They'll strike when you least expect it. You need more than just ships. You need strategy." Zorth's eyes narrowed. "Are you suggesting we don't know how to fight?" he asked, his voice cold. The Chlorith were not used to being questioned, especially by a human. "I'm suggesting that you might not know enough to win this fight," Jack replied evenly, "and you need all the help you can get." The Chlorith leader stood up abruptly, his golden eyes flashing with anger. "We don't need help from humans," he said, his voice shaking with the weight of his pride. "We've ruled this galaxy for centuries. What could a human soldier possibly know about defeating the Rethnox?" Jack stood his ground. "I know how to fight in situations where you're outnumbered. I know how to think on my feet, adapt to the enemy's moves, and outsmart them when they think they've already won."
Now for a moment.
The room was still. The council members exchanged uneasy glances. The Chlorith were proud and stubborn, but Jack's words were beginning to sink in. Maybe, just maybe, he knew something they didn't. Zorth looked away, clearly struggling to maintain his composure. "We will deal with the Rethnox in our own way," he said, his tone final. "We'll keep your advice in mind." Jack didn't respond. He knew that the Chlorith weren't ready to listen yet, but he also knew that they would be forced to eventually. The Rethnox were coming, and no amount of pride would change that. The Chlorith would learn soon enough that they couldn't fight this battle alone. As the meeting came to a close, Jack was once again left standing at the back of the room. The other species were murmuring among themselves, discussing the threat of the Rethnox. Jack had made his point, but he knew that the real challenge was yet to come. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The Rethnox were no ordinary enemy. They would strike when the Chlorith least expected it, and when they did, the galaxy would be thrown into chaos. Jack had to be ready. Back on Earth, he had faced countless dangers, wars, battles, and missions that seemed impossible. But this was different. This was the fate of the galaxy on the line, and Jack knew that humanity had to be a part of the solution. It wasn't just about saving Earth anymore. It was about saving everyone. As he walked out of the council room, Jack glanced over his shoulder at the Chlorith and the other species. They might not understand it yet, but soon they would. And when the Rethnox came, Jack would be ready. Humanity would be ready. Days passed, and the council's meetings continued. But Jack's presence remained a quiet challenge to the established order. The Chlorith continued their smug confidence, dismissing humanity as nothing more than a footnote in the galaxy's history. But Jack's words from the previous meeting lingered in the air, unsettling the Chloroth more than they cared to admit. Jack wasn't trying to impress anyone, though. He had one goal: to make sure the galaxy was prepared for the storm that was coming. He spent his days studying the Rethnox, their tactics, their methods of warfare. He knew that these ancient warriors weren't like the enemies the Chlorith had fought before. The Rethnox were relentless, unpredictable, and brutal. Jack understood that conventional tactics wouldn't work against them. He knew that the Chlorith would have to change their approach if they had any hope of defeating the Rethnox, and he was willing to show them how. One evening, as the council was preparing to meet again, Jack was summoned to Zoroth's private chambers. The Chlorith leader had been unusually quiet since the last meeting. Jack entered the chamber, where Zoroth sat at a large table, his fingers steepled in front of him. "You've caused quite a stir," Zoroth said, his voice a mixture of annoyance and curiosity. "Your words have gotten the attention of the council, human. They're starting to question whether we truly understand the threat the Rethnox pose." Jack didn't respond right away. He knew that Zoroth wasn't asking for advice. He was testing him, trying to see if Jack's knowledge could back up his confidence. "They're not just another enemy, Zoroth," Jack said calmly. "You can't win this war by relying on brute force. The Rethnox will fight in ways you've never encountered.
Own day and night.
They're experts at using the environment to their advantage. They don't play by the same rules as you." Zoroth's golden eyes flickered with something akin to doubt, but he quickly masked it. "And what do you suggest we do, human? You've told us what we can't do, but you haven't told us how to win." Jack stood still for a moment, thinking carefully. He had no intention of giving away everything. He wasn't just here to help the Chlorith. He was here to make sure the galaxy had a fighting chance. Zoroth had made the mistake of thinking that Jack was just a soldier. The truth was, Jack had a plan, and it was time to share it. "You need to think like the enemy," Jack said. "The Rethnox don't care about honor or glory. They only care about survival. They'll do whatever it takes to ensure they win. You have to stop thinking about this battle in terms of power. You have to think about it in terms of survival, just like they do." Zoroth was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on Jack. "You speak of survival? But we are the rulers of this galaxy. We do not need to think like the Rethnox." "You're wrong," Jack replied, his voice firm. "You may be rulers, but in this fight that won't matter. Shh. The Rethnox are not afraid to lose everything. In order to win, and if you don't change your strategy, you'll lose everything too." Zoroth's gaze darkened, but Jack could see the wheels turning in his mind. Wasn't used to being questioned, but there was something in Jack's eyes that made him pause. For the first time, he wasn't sure whether his forces were enough to guarantee victory. "The council will never agree to change tactics," Zoroth said. "They will never abandon their pride and their strength. They will never listen to the likes of you." "They'll have to," Jack said, stepping closer, "or they'll be wiped out. The Chlorith are strong, but they're not invincible. You'll need to adapt. You'll need to be flexible. Most importantly, you'll need to trust me. Zorath looked Jack over, his golden eyes studying him. Finally, he stood up and walked to a window, staring out into the vastness of space. "You've convinced me, human," he said quietly. "But you'll need more than just words. Want to change the course of this war? You'll need to prove it." Jack nodded. "I don't need to convince you anymore. I need you to trust me when I say this. We need to combine forces, bring together the best of each species, and fight this battle not as separate races, but as one united force. That's the only way we can stand a chance." Zorath turned back, to face Jack, his expression unreadable. "I will take your words to the council, but I cannot promise they will listen. This galaxy does not change easily." "I don't need a promise," Jack said. "I just need a chance." Zorath studied him for a long moment before giving a slight nod. "You'll have it. But remember, human, this is your last chance to prove your worth. If you fail, we will have no use for you." Jack didn't flinch. He knew the stakes. But he also knew that this was the moment when everything could change. He had no intention of failing. The galaxy had no idea what was coming, but he did. He was going to make sure they were ready. As Jack left the Clorath leader's chambers, he couldn't help but feel a sense of purpose. He wasn't just fighting for Earth anymore. He was fighting for the survival of everyone. If the galaxy was going to survive, they would need to stand together, human and alien alike. The Clorath were not the easiest species to convince. Their pride was their greatest strength and their greatest weakness. But Jack had planted the seed of doubt in their minds, and now there was no turning back. The council had been reluctant to change their tactics, but the threat of the Rethnox was too great to ignore. Jack's plan wasn't easy. It wasn't just about fighting the Rethnox in space. It was about thinking differently, acting differently, and working together in ways the galaxy had never seen before. To the Clorath, the idea of collaborating with other species was almost unthinkable. But Jack had seen the fractures in the Council's unity. If the galaxy was going to stand a chance, they would have to put aside their pride and learn to fight as one. The first step was to convince the other species. Jack knew that the Cloroth wouldn't be the only ones to make the decision. They needed help from the Elvarians, the Zinther, and even the smaller species who were often overlooked. Jack made his way to each representative, speaking with them. Explaining the situation wasn't easy. Many were still skeptical. But as Jack spoke, he noticed something in their eyes. Hesitation, yes, but also curiosity. Jack had a way of getting through to people, even when they didn't want to listen. The Clorath, despite their unwillingness to admit it, were beginning to see Jack's plan as their only option. Zoroth had reluctantly agreed to give it a try, but Jack knew it wasn't enough. It needed to prove to the Council that humanity's way of thinking could win battles, even against the toughest enemies. The day arrived when the combined forces would finally take the fight to the Rethnox. The Clorath fleet, with all its firepower, would be joined by smaller ships from the other species, including humans. Jack had been assigned to lead the human forces in the first wave. The humans had a reputation for being untested in space battles, but Jack knew better. They might not have the advanced technology of the Cloroth, but they had something just as valuable, the ability to adapt. The human fleet, small but determined, was ready. Jack stood on the bridge of one of the ships, looking out at the stars. The ship's crew was nervous, but Jack's calm presence helped ease their fears. He wasn't a general, but he had learned how to lead. And more than that, he had earned their trust. "Captain, the Clorath fleet has arrived," one of the crew members said. "They're ready to move out." Jack nodded. "All right, let's do this." The battle ahead was not going to be easy. The Rethnox had already taken several key planets, and their forces were well prepared for any attack. But Jack's plan was simple. They weren't going to go in with brute force. They would outsmart the Rethnox, strike when they least expected it, and use every advantage they had as the combined fleet moved into position. Jack sent a message to the Clorath ships, urging them to stay back and let the human ships take the first shot. He knew the Cloroth would want to charge in, guns blazing, but that was the wrong move. The Rethnox had an incredible ability to anticipate direct attacks, and if the Clorath were too eager, they would fall into the Rethnox's trap. Patience. Jack whispered to himself as he watched the enemy fleet in the distance. They were not here to destroy them head-on. We're here to outthink them. The first wave of attacks began, with human ships flying low to the Rethnox's positions. Jack had given strict orders. No direct confrontations. Instead, they would use small, quick strikes, hitting vulnerable points and disappearing before the Rethnox could retaliate. It was risky, but Jack knew that this was the only way to break their defenses. The Chlorith, watching from the rear, were growing impatient. Sroith's fleet remained in position, waiting for Jack's signal to join the fight. Chlorith were used to a more direct approach, but he had to remind them that this wasn't about honor, it was about survival. Hours passed, and the Rethnox were starting to show signs of confusion. The human ships had taken out several of their smaller ships without engaging in a full-scale battle. The Rethnox didn't know how to react to this unpredictable approach. They had expected the usual charges, the typical brute force that most species used, but they weren't prepared for humans who thought differently. Finally, Jack gave the signal. All ships, prepare for full engagement. At that moment, the Chlorith fleet moved in, and the Rethnox were caught off guard. They had been so focused on the human ship's unconventional tactics that they had failed to anticipate the full force of the Chloroth. It was a stunning victory, one that had been achieved not through sheer power, but through strategy and cooperation. As the battle ended, Jack watched from his ship's bridge, his eyes scanning the battlefield. The Rethnox were retreating, their forces broken and scattered. It had been a hard-fought battle, but the combined fleets had proven that they could defeat the Rethnox. And Jack had proven that humanity's way of thinking, adaptable, unpredictable, and strategic, was a force to be reckoned with. The Chloroth fleet sent a signal of their own. Zoroth's voice came through, surprisingly respectful. You were right, human. We fought differently this time, and it worked. We are in your debt. Jack smiled but didn't respond. The battle was over, but the real work was just beginning. The galaxy had changed today. Humanity had proven that they had a place in the future. As Jack stood on the bridge, looking out at the stars, he knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. The galaxy might have laughed at him when he first arrived, but now they knew better. Jack had changed everything. The victory against the Rethnox had shaken the galaxy. The Chlorith, once so sure of their strength, had learned the hard way that brute force wasn't enough to win a war. They had seen firsthand the power of human strategy and adaptability. The battle had been won, but the real challenge was just beginning. The Rethnox weren't the only threat lurking in the galaxy. Now humanity had proven that they could handle whatever came next. In the days following the battle, Jack had returned to Earth. It had been a long time since he had been home, but the victory had made it worth the journey. Humanity was no longer seen as a small, insignificant species. They had earned their place among the stars. But Jack knew that this new position came with its own set of challenges. The galaxy was filled with powerful enemies, and now that humanity had shown what they could do, it was only a matter of time before others came to test them. Back on Earth, Jack was greeted as a hero. His name was known across the galaxy, and humanity's place in the galaxy had been secured. But Jack didn't care about the fame or the attention. He was focused on the bigger picture. The galaxy was changing, and humanity had to be ready for what came next. As Jack made his way to the council hall, he could feel the weight of the galaxy on his shoulders. He had led humanity to victory, but now he had to ensure that the galaxy remained united. The Rethnox were only the beginning. Were other threats out there waiting to strike. And Jack knew that humanity would need more than just their military strength to survive. They would need allies, unity, and trust. It was time to take the next step. The council meeting was about to begin, and Jack stood at the entrance looking at the familiar faces of the representatives. Chlorith, the Zinther, the Elvarians, and others had all gathered for the first time since the battle. The air was thick with tension. The Rethnox had been defeated, but there were still questions. About the future, as Jack entered the hall, all eyes turned to him. The Chlorith leader Zorith was seated at the front, his golden eyes fixed on Jack. The other representatives were watching closely, waiting for what Jack would say next. Jack didn't stand on ceremony. He wasn't here for speeches or formalities. He was here to make sure the galaxy was ready for whatever came next. "I know you all have questions," Jack said, his voice steady and clear. "But right now, the most important thing is not what we've done, but what we're going to do next. We've won a battle, but the war isn't over. The Rethnoks were just the beginning. We have to prepare for the other threats that are out." There was silence in the room as Jack's words sank in. The Chlorith were still skeptical, but Jack could see the uncertainty in their eyes. They were beginning to realize that humanity was right about something they had refused to see before. They were not alone in this fight. Zoroth stood up, his expression unreadable. "And what do you suggest we do now, human?" he asked, his voice cold but thoughtful. "We need to unite," Jack said firmly. "We need to stop thinking of ourselves as separate species, but as part of a larger galaxy. We can't afford to be divided anymore. If we want to survive, we have to come together." The room remained quiet as the representatives exchanged glances. Jack's words were simple, but they carried weight. The galaxy was a dangerous place, and they couldn't afford to be divided. The Rethnoks had been defeated, but they weren't the only threat. Jack had made that clear. "Humanity has proven that we can fight alongside you," Jack continued. "But now we need to think about the future. We can't just rely on military power. We need to build alliances, share resources, and work together as equals." Zoroth looked at Jack for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You've convinced me, human," he said, his tone softer than before. "We cannot survive alone, but we cannot forget who we are either." Jack smiled, but his expression remained serious. "None of us can forget who we are, but that doesn't mean we can't work together. We can all bring something valuable to the table. If we do that, we'll be stronger than ever." The room was still for a moment as the council members processed Jack's words. Finally, the Elvarian representative, a wise and calm woman named Tyla, spoke up. "You speak of unity, human. But how can we trust each other after so many years?" "Of division," Jack paused, considering her question. He had known that this would be the hardest part. Trust wasn't something that could be given easily, especially after centuries of conflict. But Jack had learned that trust could be earned, one step at a time. "We'll start small," Jack said. "We'll share information, resources, and military support. We'll help each other when it's needed. And over time, we'll build the trust that's been missing. It won't be easy, but if we're going to survive, it's the only way." The council members exchanged glances once again, and for the first time, Jack saw something in their eyes. Hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, the galaxy could be different. Maybe they could work together, despite their differences. Maybe they could finally unite. "We will begin the process of rebuilding our alliances," Zoroth said, his voice firm. "It will take time, but we are willing to try. Stu and we will look to you, human, for guidance." Jack nodded. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing. Humanity had taken the first step toward something bigger. And no matter what came next, they would face it together. The council room was filled with a sense of anticipation. After weeks of discussion and hard decisions, the representatives from across the galaxy had agreed on something that, just a few months ago, would have seemed impossible. The galaxy, once divided by pride, fear, and old grudges, was finally starting to come together. And the one who had brought them to this point was standing quietly at the center of it, Jack Carter. The human soldier Jack had not sought power, nor had he asked for fame. All he had wanted was to protect his home and help others do the same. But now, as he stood in the council hall, the faces of the representatives told a different story. They had begun to understand that humanity was not just a side note in the galaxy's story. They were a vital part of the future. The Chlorith, who had once laughed at him, now treated him with respect. Zoroth, their leader, had even suggested that humanity lead the charge in developing a new united defense strategy. Zintha, once so proud of their battle prowess, were now looking to humans for insight into new ways of thinking, new ways of fighting. The Elvarians, peaceful and wise, had agreed to share their knowledge of diplomacy and resource management. While Jack and the humans had offered their adaptability and determination, it was a strange sight. One that would have seemed impossible just a few months ago, but it was happening. The galaxy was changing. The meeting began with a quiet murmur. Representatives took their seats, and Jack stood at the front. He had been asked to speak, but he wasn't sure what to say. It wasn't about him anymore. It wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It was about the future of the galaxy. "Thank you," Jack began, his voice steady but humble. "Thank you for giving humanity a chance. But today isn't about me or about any one species. It's about all of us. We're standing here because we chose to trust each other, to work together." He paused, looking around the room. The Chlorith, the Zinther, the Elvarians, and the smaller species were all watching him. We're not just fighting to survive anymore. We're fighting to build something better, something stronger. And the only way we can do that is by putting our differences aside and focusing on what we have in common. Jack's words were simple, but they carried a weight that everyone in the room could feel. The divisions that had once seemed insurmountable were now being bridged. And Jack knew that it wasn't just the actions of one person that had made this possible. It was the willingness of every species to take that first step. The Chloroth leader. Zoroth stood and nodded slowly. "You were right, human," he said. "We were too proud. We thought we could do it all ourselves. But we were wrong. Your species has shown us that it's not enough to be strong. Strength alone isn't what makes a species great. It's the ability to work together, to adapt and learn from each other. And for that, we are grateful." The room fell silent as Zoroth spoke. The other representatives followed his lead, standing and offering their own words of support and agreement. One by one, they spoke of unity, of cooperation, and of the hope that Jack's leadership had sparked in them all. Even the Zinther, known for their fierce independence, spoke of how they could learn from humanity's ability to adapt under pressure. When the speeches were finished, Jack took a deep breath. This was it, the moment he had worked for. Done it alone, but he had been the spark that had ignited the fire of change. And he knew that this was just the beginning. "We're not perfect," Jack said, his voice strong. "We're all still learning. But together, we can face anything. The galaxy isn't a place for one species to dominate. It's a place where we all have a part to play. And I believe that we can make this place better if we work together." The room erupted into applause, not for Jack, but for what they had all accomplished. For the first time in a long while, there was a sense of real hope in the air. The galaxy was no longer divided by pride or fear. It was united by a common goal: survival, growth, and understanding. As the applause died down, Jack looked around the room, his heart full. He had done what he had set out to do. He had brought the galaxy together. And now, humanity had a place in the future. A place of strength, unity, and respect. He didn't need to say anything more. His job was done. Now, it was up to all of them to carry the future forward. As the council meeting came to an end, Jack stepped away from the podium, his gaze drifting out the window to the stars. The galaxy was vast, and the challenges ahead were many, but Jack knew one thing: humanity would be ready. They had proven that they could adapt, learn, and fight when it mattered most. And no matter what the future held, humanity would face it with strength and resolve. For the first time in a long time, the galaxy felt like a place of possibility. And it was all because one human soldier had dared to believe that anything was possible.